Hey everybody, welcome back to Comparative Criminal Justice, Section 7. We're going to talk today about courts, okay? Not basketball courts, but, court of law courts. And one of the things that's kind of true around the world, no matter what kind of system you're talking about, is that courts are ruled by tradition. It takes a lot for any court to change a process or a policy or anything like that. In fact, they like it so much, there's an entire concept called stare decisis, which is a Latin phrase meaning let the decision stand, essentially, that courts are kind of very much focused on in order to make sure that they don't kind of radically change things on how they're conducted or how cases are processed or how decisions are made. Now, the two biggest kinds of court systems in the world, as we've discussed before, are the inquisitorial and the adversarial. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail about what each of those means. And we're going to talk a little bit about court systems other than these two, right? Because these two, while they're kind of the largest and in use in the most countries, they're not the only. Now, inquisitorial system. This is the one that most of my viewers will probably be less familiar with. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit more than I am the adversarial system, which most of my viewers are probably a little more familiar with. But with inquisitorial courts, this kind of comes out of France. And France, in the 17th and 18th centuries, really had a huge role in governing a large chunk of the world. As you can see from this map, at some point in time, the French dominated essentially all of Western Europe, except for a few far north countries and far east countries. A huge chunk of Africa, Asia, a little bit of South America, Central America. So because of that history, a lot of modern countries in these areas still use an inquisitorial system. In this inquisitorial system, the court is much more involved during the investigation process than it ever would be in an adversarial system. So judges kind of follow a case from the beginning rather than once a suspect has been arrested. So the court is heavily involved in investigations, and as such, by the time of the trial, they already kind of know everything that there is to know about the case. They know about, judges know about the evidence. They don't need to be told about the evidence from either a prosecutor or a defense attorney. The end of the investigation produces what's called a dossier. And this dossier is essentially a summary of all the facts, all the evidence for and against conviction. And the trial, therefore, is not necessarily to learn about the evidence. The trial is there just to confirm that the dossier is accurate, which is a very different purpose for having a trial in the first place. Now, let's talk about France today, not the 17th or 18th century, but today, because they are kind of an archetypal example of an inquisitorial system. So, very, very briefly, in France, there are essentially three types of crime. Okay, here in the United States, we have felonies and misdemeanors. In France, they have three. The most extreme are called crimes, and these carry penalties of 10 years and more. And in the United States, we would call these like major felonies. Not just felonies, but major felonies. These crimes are tried in a cour d'assises. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I have never spoken French. But I think that's how it's pronounced. The middle level of crime, what we would call crime, are called délits. And these are tried in a tribunal correctionnel. And then the most minor, what we would refer to probably as misdemeanors, are contraventions, which are tried in a tribunal de police. And don't let the name fool you. This is not like the old English system where police are the prosecutors. It's called the Tribunal des Police for various historical reasons we don't have the time to get into, but it's not what it sounds like, where the police are the judges or the prosecutors or whatever. Now, that highest court, the Court d'Assises, that, again, since that's kind of the biggest one, the one for the major felonies, that's kind of the one that gets the most attention. And usually, there are 3 judges and 9 public jurors, okay? And those 3 judges are not all equal. One of the 3 will be called the presiding judge, and that's the one that's kind of has the most power and the most ability to kind of know what's going on. That's oftentimes the only one that's been involved in the case since the investigation stage, and you know, it's not until the trial that it gets 2 more judges. And then, of course, the 9 jurors, which are similar to an American jury in that they're from the public. In the entire country, this major court only sees about 2,700 cases a year. That's a very, very, very low number compared to what, say, an American court might see. In the United States, we see way, way more than that for felonies. But again, remember, this court is not just for what we would call felonies. It's even the major felonies, the one that carry 10 plus years. So essentially, they have this dossier. The presiding judge gets it prior to the trial. Everybody else gets it during the trial, and they read over the evidence and all the statements by witnesses. And because those statements are recorded, there's no need to have witnesses actually come to the trial usually, although sometimes they do, in which case the jurors and the judges can ask questions, because there's not really a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney to ask questions. So it's up to the judge and then the jurors to ask questions. And then they vote. And there's a blind ballot, and it needs 8 people, whether judges or jurors or some combination of the 2, to vote for guilt. Anything less than that, they're found not guilty. And once they're found guilty, they vote again on sentencing, and it's only a majority that needs to agree for sentencing. Now, in the 2 lower courts, there's only the 3 judges. There's not a jury like we would understand it. And they're much more informal, right? So usually it'll be the 3 judges examining the witnesses, examining defendants, saying, and it's a lot less scripted than it is in the United States. A lot of times the judge will just say kind of the equivalent of, okay, tell me what happened, and have kind of a conversation with the defendant or the witness or whoever, rather than this kind of formal question and answer process that we're used to here in the United States. Now, for those who aren't aware, adversarial courts, this is more of the kind of British system, the parts of the world that the French didn't colonize, usually the British did. So places like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the United States, obviously, Canada, all these countries use kind of a descendant of the adversarial system that was kind of gifted to them by the British, if you will. And in this case, judges are kept much more separate from the investigation. Judges can be involved in investigations for things like signing warrants, but those are not necessarily, and indeed fairly rarely, the same judge that will take the case to actual trial. So in a adversarial trial, the judge is just a referee. They're not there on the side of the prosecution. They're not there on the side of the defense. They weren't involved in the investigation. Their entire job is to make sure the rules are followed. That's all we want. The jury, which is usually 12 members in most of those countries I listed, but not always, they make a decision whether the person is guilty or not guilty. and while the judge acts as a referee. And the important part here is that it's called an adversarial court because it's an adversarial process, i.e. there's two teams. There's the prosecution and there's the defense. And each one is going to make a case as to why their side is right. The prosecution is going to say, we think he's guilty. We're going to argue and argue and argue and say he's guilty. He's definitely guilty. Here's all this evidence. And the defense is going to say he's not guilty and here's all this evidence and we think this and, this could explain what happened, that, an alternative explanation for this evidence and blah, blah. And the belief here, the kind of theory, is that if both the prosecution and the defense work really hard to prove their case and the judge does their jobs to make sure that all the rules are followed, then the jury is going to be able to decide in a very objective, just manner who's right and who's wrong. Is the prosecution right and the person's guilty, or is the defense right and the person's innocent? That kind of clash, ruled over by the judge and then kind of decided on by the jury, is thought to be a much better way to determine whether somebody is guilty or not guilty. One other difference is that witnesses are only allowed to state facts. It is very rare that a witness will be able to state opinions, with the one notable exception of expert witnesses being able to state opinions on what they're an expert in. So if I were to be called as an expert in digital forensics at a criminal trial, I could state my opinion as an expert about whether this digital file was from the suspect's computer or whatever. Within my realm of expertise, I'm able to form opinions. But other than that kind of notable exception, the vast, vast, vast majority of the time, witnesses are not allowed to state their opinion. They're only allowed to say, I observed the defendant running out of the building at a high rate of speed. Things like that. They're not allowed to say, oh, yeah, I thought, he's a stupid idiot and I'm sure he did it. They're not allowed to say stuff like that. Now, what are the differences? So first off, the rules of evidence. In adversarial systems, these are very, very, very important. In inquisitorial systems, they're less formalized, they're less focused on, because there's not that adversarial process and there's not as much need to kind of have these strict rules to be sure that there's a fair fight. Rules of evidence are looser. The judges are thought to be very capable of deciding what should be allowed and what shouldn't. They kind of leave it up to the discretion of the judge rather than formalizing it, right? Because the judge has been kind of involved in the case many times since the beginning, and because they have that dossier, and the purpose isn't to talk about each piece of evidence and introduce each piece of evidence and argue about each piece of evidence. The purpose of the trial is only to confirm what's in that dossier. Inquisitorial trials are much, much, much shorter, right? In the United States, we have trials that can go on for weeks, sometimes even months. In inquisitorial systems, they can last, a couple hours, maybe, right? Really, really, really short trials. Because again, the purpose of the trial is not to bring out all this evidence. The purpose of the trial is just to say, hey, we have all this dossier. We know what all the evidence is. We know what all the witnesses have stated. Is this correct or is this not correct? Do you agree with what's in here or not agree? Do you think we're wrong? Whatever. So it's a much kind of easier process because a lot of the work that we do in trials in an adversarial system has already been done by the time the inquisitorial trial starts, right? Often, although not, I don't think every time, but often appeals are open to both the defense and the prosecution in an inquisitorial system. In adversarial systems, appeals are very often not open to the prosecution ever. Like here in the United States, in criminal trials, prosecutions can't appeal cases. That's just not a thing. Only the defense can appeal up the chain. Now, in inquisitorial systems, judges are often required to explain why they found the person guilty or not guilty, why they gave a certain sentence. In adversarial systems where juries do that, often they're forbidden by law from explaining their decisions. So there's very much a difference in kind of, do we want the decision explained or do we not, right? Now, prosecutors. Kind of the goal of the prosecutor is much different. In an inquisitorial system, the focus is on finding the truth, i.e., my job is to determine whether this defendant is guilty or not guilty. If they're guilty, I'm going to try and make sure they're convicted. If they're not guilty, I'm not going to take this to trial. Whereas in an adversarial system, because of that kind of team battle basis, the goal of the prosecutor is to prove guilt. And the job of the defense is to prove not guilt. And whoever does their job better kind of wins. Whereas in an inquisitorial system, because there's not that battle with the defense versus the prosecution, they're kind of, they don't see their job as proving that the person did it. They don't want to prove that the person's guilty. In adversarial systems, it's comparatively very, very rare for a defendant to kind of do anything at trial other than just sit there. In the United States, it's incredibly rare for defendants to actually testify at their own trial. In inquisitorial systems, it's almost universal. Defendants want to explain, hey, yeah, this is what happened, and this is what I saw, and this is what I did. In adversarial systems, a defendant's previous crimes are often not allowed to be discussed at all. The jury is absolutely not allowed to know if the defendant has committed previous crimes or not. In an inquisitorial system, it's the opposite. Like, that's nigh on always put into that dossier, so the judges and the jury, if there is a jury, can determine, can look at their previous criminal history and let that kind of affect their decision. And what it really boils down to is the active versus passive state, right? Do we want the government to take a more active role in the process of determining guilt or not guilt, and give them more latitude in decisions and investigations and all these kind of criminal justice processes? Or do we want them to be more passive and have more kind of controls, especially normal citizen controls? Grand juries and petite juries, and who gets to determine guilt or not guilt. And so the adversarial system relies much more on the passive state, whereas the inquisitorial system has a lot more trust in the professional judges and their ability to determine what's right and wrong for this case, and what's justice and what's not justice. One of the other systems we're going to talk briefly about is Islamic law. And we could have an entire course just on Islamic law. This is a very, very, very brief overview of a very complicated system. But Islamic law is also called Sharia law, and it's kind of law by divine revelation, right? It's according to that religion, this law is not from like in the United States, our law comes from the Constitution, which was written by guys we can name. We have their picture. In Islamic law, the law comes down not from the Constitution written by humans, but from the divine, God through the prophets, right? So because of that, there's kind of a different view in what the purpose of the law is, right? In most kind of civil law systems or non-religious law systems, we want the law to control crime. And if the law isn't controlling crime, we want to change it and make it better. Whereas in Islamic law, because of this divine origin, it doesn't really matter whether it's doing its job or not. It's the right thing to do because God says it's the right thing to do. Why would we change it just because it's not having some of the traditionally desired outcomes? Now, in some countries that have Islamic law, it makes up part of the law. In some countries, it's the entire law, right? That's the only law they have is this religious law dictated by God. But in other countries, it's only for certain, say, religious-based crimes, and then they have an entire non-religious legal system for kind of traditional crime, right? Sharia law recognizes kind of two types of crime. There's crimes against God and there's crimes against people. So crimes against God would be things like apostasy, heresy, that kind of stuff. Whereas crimes against people are things like assault and theft and, you know, those kind of things. One interesting note that a lot of kind of Western observers will find disturbing is that in a lot of countries that use Islamic law, they're not allowed to have female witnesses. Like you could have 1,000 women witness a crime, but you can't call them into court to be witnesses because they're women. Even in Islamic law countries where they do allow women to be witnesses, often they're kind of not given as much weight as a male witness. So that's one kind of very big difference between Islamic law and modern Western non-religious law. Now, another quick thing we want to talk about is indigenous law, i.e. Law from indigenous peoples around the world, kind of pre-Western colonization. And there are two examples here. The top one is in Australia. In Australia, there were dozens of different cultures and legal systems and languages and, you know, all these different groups that were living there prior to Western colonization and the imposition of their current adversarial law system. And in a lot of cases, especially in the more remote areas of the country, there is still kind of an informal indigenous law system going on, especially for the more minor crimes. In a lot of cases, when there's a major crime, they'll send that to the kind of normal authorities for trial in an actual adversarial Australian court. But for the relatively minor stuff, like you know, getting drunk and punching somebody, or, you know, minor theft and things like that, in a lot of cases, there's a more informal village court where kind of the judges or the jury or both are made up of just kind of elders of the community who will decide, like, whether the person was in the right or in the wrong and what their punishment should be. And it completely bypasses the actual official legal Australian system. And the legal Australian system kind of accepts this, or at least it doesn't actively try to stop it, right? And it's a system that works. In a very similar situation, there's Alaska. And in Alaska, you know, again, there were a lot of different kind of indigenous groups that were native to the area prior to Western colonization. And in a lot of cases, again, especially in the more remote areas, the vast majority of the population is still descendants of those native peoples. And they had their own legal systems long before, you know, people that look like me ever arrived. So they kind of have an informal method of dealing with, again, usually relatively minor crimes, where you know, the offender is just brought forward again to kind of elders of the community, and they get to decide kind of, did this person do the wrong thing, and if so, what kind of punishment should we have? And interestingly, there's a lot of kind of non-natives that come into these areas, hunting guides, sometimes, you know, kind of extreme tourists and things like that. And when those people commit these same kind of even low-level crimes, the natives realize that, like, hey, they're not part of our culture, they're not part of our system, so we're not going to give them this informal trial process with the elders. We're just going to hand them over to the Alaskan police, right? So this kind of system is kind of by natives, for natives, and even in those same native areas, if a non-native does something, they won't put them through that informal process with the village and the community. They'll kind of, you know, send them to Juneau or Fairbanks or wherever, for a traditional trial in the American tradition. Now, the last thing I want to note here is that these court systems, I know I've said it before, none of these systems are pure, right? There are example after example after example of inquisitorial systems with more or fewer juries and situations where they would have a jury and jury power. So inquisitorial courts sometimes have adversarial elements, and adversarial courts sometimes have inquisitive elements. One of the prime examples here is Japan, right? So when Japan first started kind of opening itself up to the West in the 19th century, they created an inquisitorial system, and they got a bunch of French legal scholars to come in and help them build a legal system. And then post-World War II, the American occupation and kind of forced restructuring of a lot of their government systems, they got a lot of adversarial stuff from the United States. So they're this really weird hybrid conglomeration of inquisitorial and adversarial systems. But even without that kind of extreme history and shoving together of two systems, there's always kind of things that creep in and little differences. Even the UK and the US, which are two very, very similar criminal court systems, we can find lots and lots and lots of differences. So the point is, the ultimate goal of all these systems is justice. We want justice to be done. We want bad guys to be punished. We want innocent people to not be punished. We want victims to face, the justice they're supposed to get. It's just different methods of getting there. At what point do we do this? At what point do we do that? How do we ensure that innocent people don't get convicted? How do we ensure that convicted people do get convicted? It's just different answers to those questions. All these different systems have processes to accomplish all the goals we want accomplished. They just do it at different times in the process and in slightly different ways. And each system, whether you're talking about the American system or the French system or the system in India or the system in Bangladesh or South Africa or Brazil, they all have systems in place to accomplish these different goals. They just look different in when and how those things happen. That's the ultimate lesson here for not only this section, but for essentially the entire course. Now, that's the end of the section. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you watching.